Nicholas Carr, thank you for joining me today.
Pleasure. Thank you.
As I looked over sort of your career trajectory, some of your early writing in the Atlantic, the Shallows, and up to the work that you're doing now today, it seems like you got to this kind of tech skepticism fairly early. It's in the air now. There are more people who are raising the alarm or at least asking us to think critically about what new technologies are doing to us or what negative impacts they might have, rather than just hyping up the fact that they're new and cool and interesting. I'm just curious, what was it that led you to this kind of early skepticism of technology?
I'm sure there were a lot of reasons, but in retrospect, I kind of think of um, I think of two events in particular. I actually started writing about technology, and in particular, the internet, digital media, in 1999, which was the peak of the first dotcom boom. Huge amounts of excitement, enthusiasm about the internet and how it was going to revolutionize business. Huge amounts of very risky investment going on. In some ways, it kind of what's going on with AI today is kind of similar to what was going on in 1999 with the first phase of the internet. And there was good reason to be enthusiastic. And I mean, the reason I started writing about technology is because I was enthusiastic about it. I enjoyed computers and computer networks. Um, but then very shortly thereafter, the whole dot-com bubble collapsed, burst. And it had a lot of effects on people. A lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of people who had bought into the enthusiasm and invested their retirement savings in it lost their retirement savings. So that experience kind of taught me two things. One is that the we should be we are I think people are naturally enthusiastic and get naturally excited by new technologies because they're cool and interesting, and in that enthusiasm is of course reinforced and amplified by the technology business that has a financial interest in keeping us excited by it. But it taught me that we need to be skeptical, particularly when there's a lot of hype and uh, a lot of emphasis on all the great things that are going to happen, and kind of no one looking at possible downsides. Um, it, but it also taught me that experience also showed that what the consequences that we initially see coming from a new technology might not really have might not really be in the end the most important consequences that come out of it, because after the crash, the market crash and the end of the dot-com bubble, we saw in fact in the early 2000s that the social aspects of the technology, not the economic and financial uh, aspects, might in fact be the biggest implications, biggest consequences. And back in the early dot-com boom, people were focused only on the financial and the business and
Mm.
side, and kind of the whole social bulletin boards and chat rooms and stuff was kind of dismissed as childish. And it turned out that the social effects ultimately have been the biggest change of all. And then the other event or experience was much more personal, which is that as I continued to be online more and more through the early 2000s, yeah, spending a lot of time, and this is before smartphones came along, so we're talking about laptops and desktops and stuff, and more time online, more time clicking links, Googling stuff, gathering lots of information. I became aware that it seemed like the technology was altering the way I think, was altering the way my mind works. I had always, up till then, been a kind of literary person who liked reading long books and essays and found it easy to immerse myself in that kind of experience and concentrate. And I was having trouble doing that. And when I looked into what was going on with myself, what it seemed clear is that the technology of the internet was training me to want constant stimulation in many different forms, to want to be able to click on links and see new things immediately. And it was at the same time, therefore, undermining my ability to concentrate and to focus. And this was very concerning to me. And that kind of began my research into how our minds work, how they think, how they're influenced, how we think, how we're influenced intellectually by technology, which led to the book The Shallows. So those two things, one kind of just a broad broad sense that we should be skeptical about technological enthusiasm, and the other, this very kind of intimate personal experience with the technology and how it seemed to be changing me in a deep and disturbing way.
If you look through kind of the history of, I'm going to say tech skepticism, but I just mean it as broad kind of critiquing the adoption of new technologies or thinking about their negative consequences. Obviously, Neil Postman is a giant figure here. Robert Putnam doesn't get mentioned as often, but much of his book, Bowling Alone, is actually about television and about what television did to our social lives. And I read these books and I think, oh, they saw it coming. Oh, and then I revisited The Shallows recently, thought, oh, Carr saw something that was going to happen. It was already happening. And yet, I mean, some of these books are bestsellers. Some of these books, they sell fabulously well. People talk about them, they cite them, but the rate of technological adoption has, if anything, increased. People are doing more and more online, and they're just eager to find new and new technologies. One of these technologies that I think we could talk about in a little bit that I'm particularly worried about is the fact that there are already companies, not just OpenAI, that want to create, say, like AI wearables that become your friend. There's a company called Friend that has a very ominous looking trailer online. And it's literally, the idea is you'll never have to be alone. You'll never, and I look at it and I'm horrified. And now the early reviews are out and people are saying, wow, this is life changing. And I agree it's life changing. I just think we mean different things by life changing. And I'm just wondering, how do you sort of keep going when, some people listen, but the culture at large is probably as optimistic about technology as it's ever been.
I guess I draw a distinction between, people listening and people changing their behavior, which is two different things. I think compared to when I, started raising some of these concerns in, the mid 2005 to 2010, when The Shallows
Mhm.
came out, we were still in the grip of this huge, not only technological enthusiasm about the internet, but a kind of worship of the big tech companies and their leaders. We saw them as kind of saviors that were bringing
Mhm.
this unlimited amounts of information to us. And if you look at attitudes since then, they've changed dramatically. I mean, people don't worship the big tech leaders like Mark Zuckerberg and stuff anymore. They're very suspicious of them, and they're very suspicious of big tech. They're still part of society that loves the technology companies and stuff, but generally, people are much more skeptical. The public has changed its attitude, I think, toward the technology and the technology industry. It hasn't changed its behavior.
Mhm.
As you say, we continue to adopt the latest technologies and become more and more dependent on them. And it just shows, um, you know, it just shows that there's something fundamental about the technology, even if it's being harmful to us, that is fabulously entertaining and
Mhm.
diverting and useful.
Mhm.
People don't spend all this time online because it's not useful or not diverting, not enjoyable. Um, in that aspect of of the technology is one thing that's very interesting to me and that I write about. But I guess the way I keep going is because I've never seen, as a writer, I've never considered myself fundamentally an advocate or a crusader. I've seen myself as a critic, and
Mhm.
it's not my job to change how people live. That's up to them. It's my job, so to speak, to kind of look at what I see as these very complex and very important phenomena that are changing culture and changing society and changing people's lives, and try to explain them, try to bring lots of different perspectives to them
Mhm.
in a way that is engaging and illuminating to an audience, to the public. And if I do that, I think I've kind of succeeded in my job as a critic. And after that, it's up to people to make their own decisions about how they behave and how they interact with the technology.
Well, then how has it, I don't know, changed the way that you interact with technology? Because
Uh,
as writers or people on trying to get a message out, the internet is the option. I make a lot of YouTube videos. It's my biggest platform, and some of them are very critical of the way that online entertainment can, what it can do to you. And of course, a common comment I'm going to receive is, well, then why are you on YouTube? And my answer is, because it's where everyone is. You have to go where people are to tell them how bad things are.
yeah, and it's kind of a paradox or a conundrum or one of those things. I started writing a blog back in 2005 and wrote it for almost 20 years, and then switched over to Substack, as you mentioned, and writing new cartographies there. So I've used the internet as a platform for personal expression for a long time, and I value it
Mhm.
as that. On the other hand, I'm very sad that it's eroding things like print media, something more tangible, because I
Mhm.
think that's actually a better medium to get things across. But as you say, you go to where the audience is, um, as a writer, and then there's another angle to it, which is I'm writing mainly about technology, about things that I think are often having harmful effects, but I have to keep using them, because if I stop using them, then I have nothing to write about.
Yeah.
I have to keep researching, and researching means using the technology. So
Mhm.
the sad fact is that even though I'm probably at this point hyper aware of some of the negative consequences of using the technology, particularly using it a lot, I I too have not really changed my behavior. In some of this, I want to say is for professional reasons, but I suspect some of it is because I also like the diversion and the entertainment and the
Mhm.
usefulness and the efficiency of the technology. So I'd like to, I'd like to present myself as this paragon of somebody who's figured out how to use the technology productively and well, but unfortunately, I can't do that.
And that might show just how hard it is to find the right balance. If you could spend decades thinking through these issues, and then at the end of the day say, I'm still figuring it out. I mean, that might just reflect the
I
complexity of the
think
problem.
it reflects the complexities of the technology, which is constantly changing, constantly advancing,
Mhm.
as we're told, and also the complexities of human psychology, which
Mhm.
which are endlessly fascinating. Sometimes work on our behalf, and sometimes work against us.
In Superbloom, I mean, a theme throughout that book, of course, is that there are these technologies that throughout history have been purported to, they're going to draw us together. They're technologies of connection. But fairly consistently, we find that the more we become connected, the more it seems like that we're being torn apart, or the more that social cohesion breaks down in some ways. I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about maybe some of the early optimism that was even there for things like radio, and how this was going to democratize information and perhaps lead to a more flourishing democracy, so that we can just see how this problem isn't really new. It didn't start with the internet. And in fact, maybe understanding some of these older technologies is going to help us illuminate our current situation.
Yeah, and the commercial radio came around in the 1920s, but almost a century before that, in the 1840s, we saw the invention of the telegraph, which was the first kind of electric or electronic, as we'd say today, technology. So it was the first time that speech and information, human expression, could move faster than human beings could carry it. Up till then, it was the postal system and stuff, and uh, uh, you know, communication technologies were essentially transportation technologies. You put a letter onto a ship or on the back of a horse or whatever, and send it off wherever you want to go. So the telegraph comes along, and suddenly long distance communication is instantaneous. Um, and this creates huge enthusiasm, not just enthusiasm, but kind of wonder. Um, and it has a religious aspect, a spiritual aspect. For the first time, it seems like, something essential to an individual human being can be separated from their physical body and have its own life zipping around as an electric current somewhere. And people very much saw it in spiritual terms. There were, in the book I talk about, ministers and preachers kind of talking about this as a gift from God that shows that that we have a spirit that can be separated from our body. Um, and that kind of enthusiasm continues, and it's not just, it becomes broader than just kind of this spiritual sense. It becomes this sense that because we can communicate instantaneously with basically anyone around the world, then that's going to solve all society's problems, because all society's problems in this view come from a fact that people can't talk to each other easily.
Mhm.
So yeah, so you get people like Nikola Tesla in the end of the 1800s, who's working on radio at that point, what would come to be called radio, and he says in an interview, he says, "I'm going to be remembered as the guy um, who solved the problem of war,
Mhm.
who got rid of war. We're not going to have a war anymore because there's not there's no way you would fight somebody when you can talk to them instead." And then we have Marconi, who actually does invent radio, who says something very, very similar. You know, there's not going to be any war anymore because it's going to be ridiculous, the whole thought of it. And he says this, I think, in 1913. And of course, in 1914, World War I breaks out. I mean, one thing that surprised me is, on the one hand, you can understand why we'd think that simply by communicating with other people, we'd be able to solve problems before they turn into wars or conflicts or whatever, because we have this very optimistic view of communication as a kind of panacea to problems. Just talk with it. We can talk everything out. But if you look at how World War I started, there's historians who show that what happened, and this is not the only reason, but one of the things that happened is, this is the first time that there's this international conflict when you have telephone lines and telegraph lines, and you have the ability of governments to send instantaneous messages to other governments and stuff. And rather than calming the situation, it exaggerates the conflict, because it used to be, okay, if there's some conflict, you'd send diplomats to another capital, and it would take time, and they'd sit down in a room together and try to talk things out. Now you have all these messages, short messages, zipping back and forth, and it heightens all the tensions. Because people aren't talking face to face, they distrust what they're hearing, stuff, and it actually accelerates the path to war. And even as that's happening, militaries can use the technology to mobilize much more quickly. So you put those two things together, and exactly the opposite of what we expect to happen, which is an increase in harmony and ability to work things out before they become huge problems. The technology, because of the way it works, actually accelerates the path to war, accentuates the conflicts. And I think I think that moment is fundamental to kind of understanding what we've seen ever since then, which is that we have this theoretical view of communication. Oh, it must be good. But that discounts the way that when communication speeds up, things get shorter. You lose subtlety, you lose nuance. People become overwhelmed. They become distracted. They begin to be suspicious. And so when you put the technology together with human nature, human psychology, there's this fundamental conflict in that more communication does not necessarily lead to more understanding. In fact, it often leads to more misunderstanding. And I think that's kind of the history of communication technology ever since. And certainly with the internet and social media, the ability to share information becomes extreme, but all the kind of psychological conflicts also become extreme.
Can you tell me a little bit about this concept you use in the book of dissimilarity cascades and the way that, we've talked a little bit on the international level, communication erodes trust or relationships or diplomatic relationships. But there's psychological work, it seems, that would indicate that the way that we communicate as individuals also is going to lead us to, frankly, just like each other less.
The same thing we see at the kind of institutional, international, general level, you very much see at a personal level, with personal relationships. Because here too, we have this very optimistic view of communication that, if we just learn more about each other, we'll understand each other better, and we'll like each other better, and we'll get along better. Which is kind of one of the fundamental optimistic views that underpinned social media in the beginning. You had the people who are running these things say, no, we're going to have more harmony. People are going to get to know each other better and stuff. But it's very interesting because if you look at the actual psychological literature, you see it's much more complicated than that. In this concept of the dissimilarity cascades, I think is very important. It's long been known in the psychological literature, and I think this is a pretty well established fact, that human beings have a bias to like people who they sense are similar to themselves and to dislike people who they sense are dissimilar to themselves. And now I want to say that's a bias. As with other biases, you can overcome it. And we've all had experiences where our initial impression of someone is lukewarm or negative, but we grow to like them. So but there is this bias to like people who we sense are like ourselves. And what we assume is, well, the more we learn about somebody else, the more we'll see how they're like us, and therefore the more we'll like them. But in 2007, this group of researchers led by a guy named Michael Norton, I think at Harvard Business School, did this very interesting series of experiments where they got people together. Some of them were college students, as is true of many experiments, but others were people who were using a dating site online. And what they did is they gave people character traits about another person, a fictional person, and they varied the number of traits they gave and so forth. And then when they analyzed the data, they saw that actually the more a person learns about another person, about characteristics of that other person, the more likely they are to dislike that person, not to like them, which goes against our instincts and goes against a lot of assumptions in psychology up to then. And they looked more carefully at it, and what they saw is that our instinct to like someone else is strong, but our instinct to dislike another person is actually slightly stronger. So when you start getting more information about somebody, as soon as you see some way that they're different from you, some way that they're unlike you, you start to put more and more emphasis on those aspects of difference, on the dissimilarities. So as more information comes on, you kind of highlight in your mind the dissimilarities and begin to discount the similarities. And they term this a dissimilarity cascade. Now, this was a controversial study because it seemed to contradict other findings about, people, strangers who get together and start talking tend to like each other. But as the researchers pointed out, that's true. But their experiment, the design of their experiment kind of reflects how we're coming to know other people, which is through social media, through online conversations, through Googling them and stuff. And so we begin to gather lots of information about people very quickly because they're posting about themselves all the time and putting up photos and stuff. And we begin to emphasize how they're how they're dissimilar to us, unlike us. So if you sit down with someone, a stranger, people tend to be, when they're talking person to person with someone they don't know, they kind of are restrained in talking about themselves. That you don't sit down and start telling everything about yourself to a stranger. And so you can see how when people talk person to person, there's kind of this measured approach to revealing stuff about yourself. You gauge what the other person is thinking, how they're reacting to learning about what you like, the movies you like or whatever. And then slowly, as relationships deepen, you divulge more and more about yourself. It's totally a different dynamic online. Online we are encouraged to and rewarded for disclosing as much information about ourselves as possible. We're not looking into somebody else's eyes. We're looking into a screen where you want to collect likes and followers and friends and retweets and so forth. So this dynamic of social media in some ways is the perfect. If you wanted to design a media system that would set off dissimilarity cascades, social media is kind of precisely what you design because it encourages people to kind of disclose as much as possible, as quickly as possible about themselves. And and as a result, we get these sets of traits coming at us all the time, and we begin to see, oh, this person's not like me, and so I'm going to end up being suspicious of them and mistrustful, and ultimately am going to see them as kind of an enemy.
You see this online too. You see it in Twitter bios, but I think maybe it's most obvious if you look at how dating sites are set up, that we present ourselves to each other as like this bundle of facts and categories. Like I'm not an individual really. I'm the bundle of tropes that kind of fills out this list. So here's my height, here's my religion, here are my political beliefs, here are my three favorite movies. For other people it'd be, your disability status or other identity markers, or we find these categories, and it's like we're very quick now to place ourselves in them, almost as a way to make ourselves intelligible to other people. And yet, when I think about why I love my wife, it's not actually because of her favorite movie. And it's not even particularly because of, her national origin or something, the kind of stuff that would get disclosed very early. I mean, that's hard to obscure, but the kinds of things you would put up front on a profile. I love her in part because of the story of her life, and then the way that our stories have kind of entwined. And it seems to me that by being so quick to divulge as much information as possible, we're sort of also forced to compress ourselves down into easily understandable categories, because it's very hard to divulge a lot of information about you as an individual. It's sort of making sense of a phrase I think you use in the book, but the William James phrase, right? It's like this buzzing, blooming world. Well, we're sort of these like buzzing, blooming individuals. And if we present ourselves like that to others, they're going to be overwhelmed in a sense and not know what to make sense, like how to make sense of us. So what we do is we say, let me make it easy for you.
Right.
Here are my 7 traits.
And you see this, very early on with social media. One of the fundamental aspects of Facebook when it started was categorization. You'd set up a profile and you'd have drop down lists. So, gender, occupation, favorite movies, all these things. And so, and this is a reflection of the way computer networks work. They can only deal with explicit information.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to kind of reduce yourself to a set of traits to be, as you said, to be legible to other people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as we've adapted to this way of presenting ourselves, something fundamental about how we even see ourselves, much less others, has changed. We begin to present ourselves as media content. We're kind of
Mm-hmm.
producers of our own self that are then, broadcast to an audience through various apps, through the internet and stuff. And we begin to curate, as the common phrase is, this 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 content that is ourselves. And we judge the success of that content again by explicit markers. You know, how many reposts is this getting? How many comments? What kind of emoji are coming back to me? How fast are people responding to my message or not responding to my message? And so all of these explicit markers become kind of market research about ourselves that comes back to us, and it looks very much like the way any kind of media content is produced and then judged
Yeah.
by audience response. And so I do think that we've kind of more and more we see ourselves and others as content, explicit content that is broadcast through this medium.
You might even do some A/B testing. On Instagram, I'm like this. I feature my outdoorsy side. On Twitter, I'm a little more aggressive. Which one takes off? Well, I guess I should be the aggressive guy. I'm the politics guy, right?
Yeah, and you even see, particularly true of younger people a while ago, you'd have several different Instagrams, uh,
Mhm.
uh, personas through Finsta and other things. And often you'd use, exactly as you say, you'd use them to test different aspects of how you were coming across to a smaller audience before you broadcast them to a larger audience.
Mhm. And so decisions about who you kind of fundamentally are become reception test. Like, you just, what is it that what plays well, and very quickly that escalates too to divulging fairly intimate secrets. Your traumatic history. You'll find people who broadcast that very quickly. And one of the things I liked in the sort of middle section of your book was when you talked about the research on submarines and about how people develop intimate relationships or just close personal relationships. They kind of follow this sequence, and the idea that you would disclose your deepest, darkest secrets or the worst thing that's ever happened to you at the very beginning, it seems to be like a total inversion of how we've built relationships for, thousands or millions of years.
Yeah. So there's this um, research that started off in the military where people are together in close quarters in submarines and on destroyers and stuff. And so if you're the Navy and stuff, you really want what what kind of relationships are going to emerge between these groups of sailors. Um, but the researchers began to look much more broadly at this question of how relationships develop, because at the time, and I think this was in the early 60s or something, there actually, even though that this is so important to our personal lives, there wasn't all that much research in how do personal relationships progress or regress or fall apart or whatever. And they began to see that there's this balance that you see in how relationships grow between exposing yourself and withholding yourself. Um, and the deepest relationships go through a series of stages where you're strangers, and so you're very careful about what you divulge about yourself, and you're very careful to kind of read the other person, try to read the other person, and the other person's doing the same with you. Then you meet a couple of more times, and you start to divulge more about yourself and maybe your family and your past, but you're still withholding very sensitive stuff. And as it goes on, then you become friends, and then you become close friends. Maybe you become romantically involved. And at the deepest, at the furthest range of relationships, then you're very, very open, and you're not withholding much. But they emphasize that these two things, kind of openness and closedness, expressing yourself and withholding something, um, are both extremely important to good relationships. And they're both, we have to pay attention to both of them. So we have to pay attention to the desire to express ourselves and the desire to be private individuals, to keep some things hidden, to keep some things private. That all goes out the window online because, as you said, we're encouraged because we're kind of constantly measuring ourselves by the responses we get. We're encouraged to divulge deep things about ourselves, secrets, traumas, and stuff, because we know that that's the kind of content that gets noticed and that trends and that draws in a lot of viewers. So we have everything. We should have this balance between disclosure and reticence or privacy. And online, everything goes to disclosure, and we kind of forget the fact that to be psychologically healthy, but also to be in good relationships, we also have to maintain a certain level of privacy. And so I think that this shows how, despite all our hopes for social media, there's a lot of fundamental conflicts between the technology and human psychology that we often just don't understand or don't appreciate.
Did you, by any chance, ever read the Dave Eggers novel, The Circle? It was also a
Yes.
movie, but the
Yeah.
movie apparently
Yeah, the movie
wasn't
wasn't
very.
very good. I did. Yeah.
One of the things, I was revisiting it recently. I think I read it when it came out. Um, it's one of those books that I think it freaked me out when I first read it, and if anything, Eggers was too optimistic. Because we won't have to go into too many details, but a kind of critical part of the book is that the main character, May, is encouraged to go transparent. So she's going to broadcast her entire life and it's under the auspice that secrets really are they're kind of mean. Sharing is caring is one of the phrases that the
Right.
company starts to use all the time. And I always thought, oh, this is Eggers taking to an extreme our tendency to disclose ourselves online. So I should delete my Facebook. That was my takeaway. Um,
Yeah.
it's been more than a decade, I think, since that book came out. Within a couple of years, we had Twitch streamers who literally never turn the camera off. There is a woman on Twitch who has not stopped streaming, I think, for 3 straight years. And she basically doesn't leave her house very often. When she does, she sets up something so that it can follow her. Um, Her friends, when they come over, she has to tell them, like, if you're going to come over, you're going to be on stream. And it's kind of a gambit to see how much attention can I get. I think the sad part, I think, for a long time is it didn't work. So she was doing all of this self disclosure, and she wasn't even making that much money. Um, but I think that's going to become, if anything, more common. Maybe not to the extreme of every single moment of my life, even while I'm sleeping. But it's a regular thing for Twitch streamers to do. If they want to raise a lot of subs, they'll do a streamathon, and they'll literally sleep on stream, and they'll have phone calls with their spouse or with their girlfriends on stream. And this thing that I thought Eggers was just making up and was almost comically awful is now a major source of entertainment. Um, and I think when you look at it from the perspective of some of the psychological research you bring into the book and you've brought up here, it's actually kind of inevitable that those streamers will, or those online personas, as they divulge more about themselves, they'll gain large audiences very quickly because people are interested in this. And then eventually they will come to be hated because people will start discovering enough about them. And the dissimilarity cascade can kind of kick off. Um, and so it seems to me that at least part of the solution to some of our online problems is we might just need to know less about each other.
And I think that's right. The only the problem is that the incentives are not there to disclose less about
Mm-hmm.
ourselves. When you think about, you know, there's no question that over the last 10, 15, 20 years, people's social lives have moved more and more online. And you look at surveys of teenagers, and to me, this is like one of the most amazing things is that, over the last 10 years, 10 years, 15 years ago, if you asked a typical teenager, how do you like to interact with your friends? They'd say, well, we like to hang out together and do things together. And now it's exactly the opposite. Like 2/3 in the most recent surveys, 2/3 of teenagers would actually prefer to interact with their friends through apps, through media, through their phones, through texts and stuff. To me, having grown up and had a lot of fun and a lot of joy getting together and hanging out with friends, that just seems bizarre. But it shows how powerful the technology is in making it kind of easy and simple to communicate and to socialize, and also the way it reduces certain social risks because you're not there and visible and stuff, and so you have this medium that you can monitor and go through. But as a result, I think we have kind of we have changed the way we express ourselves to suit the medium. And one fundamental aspect of social media in the internet is that if you're quiet, you disappear.
Mm-hmm.
If you're at a party or you're out with a group of friends and people are talking, you don't feel compelled to constantly talk. You don't disappear because you're silent for a little while. You're still part of the group. You're still seen. You're still reacting. Online, if you go quiet, you disappear entirely. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so so in order to maintain one's social presence and social life, you we're constantly encouraged to say, oh, here's something about me. Here, I'm here. Here, let me comment on that. Let me post this. Let me show you this picture and stuff. So on the one hand, I totally agree that if we could back away a little and not be so eager to just talk about ourselves and disclose stuff about ourselves, our relationships online or offline would actually improve. But the design of the technology works against that.
there have been companies that try to come up with like a more humane social media. You can only post a few times a day, or there won't be any algorithms, so you have to go find things yourself. Blue Sky does this to some extent, but there's been lots, right? And the fact that I can just say that, and you could even hear the dismissal in my voice because we forget about them. Because in a way, they're not fun to use. Like, even as someone who believes in the mission, I might download it and look at it and go, what's the point? I'm not seeing the stuff that would keep me here.
Right.
So it seems like even it's not just that the incentives aren't there as the internet is currently designed, but the question is, would it even be possible to build an internet or some platform on the internet that didn't have these incentives?
I think it's certainly possible at a technical level, but I don't think, barring some big cultural change,
Yeah.
and you never know when a countercultural movement will emerge, so that's not impossible. But people, you, I remember when, and this wasn't all that long ago, when Instagram went from a feed that was chronological with people you followed, and then it threw that out, and now you get the algorithmic feed that
Mhm.
fine tuned to figure out what's going to keep you scrolling through it. And it's much worse. It's horrible, actually. And yet, I find myself sometimes scrolling through this stuff that is not particularly interesting, but somehow it's interesting enough to keep me scrolling in it.
Yeah.
And so it works in some fundamental way, even though it's not as good. Um, and I do think that one thing I talk about in the book toward the end is this whole idea of frictional design. That the big problem with social media is what people like Mark Zuckerberg and other people think is the great advantage to it, which is that it removes friction from communication and friction from relationships. So you don't have to go out and meet somebody. You don't have to buy a stamp and put it on a letter. You don't have to kind of write your thoughts out, in kind of a long form. It's just very, very simple and very, very automated and very, very efficient and frictionless to share information about yourselves. And so there's this group of, software writers and philosophers and stuff, excuse me, who say this is the big problem. We thought it was a good thing to remove friction, but actually friction slows us down. It makes us think more. It makes us care more about the other people. So what we need to do is redesign all these things to put more friction back in, to
Mhm.
put delays between when you post something and when it goes live, to slow down, reposts and retweets, and to put other constraints on the speed and volume of communication. And I think that would work. I think that's a really good idea. I don't think people are going to stand for it, because once you get used to the speed and the volume and the stimulation of all this, for somebody to say, oh, now let's all slow down, it becomes kind of intolerable. And we've
Yeah.
all experienced this when we go from having, a very fast internet connection to a slightly slower one. The difference might be microseconds or seconds in how things appear, but it seems intolerable once you get
Yeah.
used to all this stimulus and stuff. So on the one hand, I think this idea of putting more friction, putting kind of speed bumps into the internet and into social media is a very good idea. I just don't think people are going to stand for it.
You want to look behind the curtain, someone who posts on YouTube, and when you put a new video out, YouTube is showing you analytics on likes and views within seconds. And it will tell you within an hour whether or not your video is doing better than average or worse than average based on your last 10 videos. And there are these nice green arrows if you're doing better. If you get a 1 out of 10, so it's the best video of the last 10 you've released, you get a little confetti. And if it's below, you get these gray arrows that point down. And I've heard from, fellow creators who will talk to people at YouTube and they'll say, this makes me depressed. This is actually like psychologically damaging. Um, and YouTube's like, yeah, we could see that, but it's really useful. And so the idea that you would be able to like opt out of those graphics, or maybe get a summary of your analytics in 24 hours so that you wouldn't be able to see it immediately. Because once the video's out, it's out. You can't do anything. And maybe one of the secrets to being happy is learning to not worry about the things that are out of your control. Well, this gives you all of the data you would need to worry. and you could do almost nothing about it.
Right.
Uh, and yet, I don't think anyone building a platform would think, yeah, let's show fewer analytics to our creators.
I mean, certainly it's in YouTube's interest to make sure its creators get as much attention and as much engagement as possible. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
yeah,
so we
so
might if we release a flop, we feel bad, but that means we're going to do better next time.
right,
Yeah.
carrot and the stick, and they're very good at wielding both of those. Yeah.
Are there certain practices that you've brought into your own life to try to make just your relationship with technology better, to maybe sort of obviate some of these effects that you point out?
I mean, yeah. Again, I don't want to present myself as somebody who's figured this out because I struggle with all the things I talk about. But I mean, after I wrote The Shallows, this was in 2010, so smartphones had been around for like 3 years. The iPhone was introduced in 2007. It was quite clear to me that the smartphone, as bad as the distractions and the interruptions were on laptops and desktop computers, I knew for a fact that if as soon as you get a smartphone and you're carrying the technology with you all the time, and so it's always there, it's always connected, that all the bad things I saw about how digital media undermines attention and makes us more superficial was going to get worse. So I held off for a long time, but then there was a point after I wrote another book that I was going to do, that I did a book tour, and and there was a lot of coordination going on. So I said, to hell with it, I'll just get a smartphone. Um, and of course, everything bad that I thought would happen happened, and I still have the smartphone and I use it as much as ever.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a struggle for me. I mean, I'm very. I also saw very early on that social media was designed to accentuate these problems that I had written about, to, through notifications, through alerts, through the types of things you're talking about with YouTube, and the signals that are constantly sent, the measures that are constantly sent. They're designed to keep us on screen, to keep us scrolling, to keep us overstimulated with information. And so, I mean, I have been very cautious about being active on social media. I have an Instagram account that's private and just has some close friends and family members and stuff. I'm not active on Facebook. Not really active on X. So I've been fairly successful, even though I go on those platforms to do research. I've been fairly successful at maintaining a personal distance from them, which I think is helpful. I do my best, even though it's a constant battle with the technology and the technology companies, to turn off notifications. The way I talk about this is that the tech industry is very interested not only in gaining your attention, but in taking over control of your attention. And this is what algorithmic feeds do. The company itself determines what you look at
Mm-hmm.
moment by moment. And notifications and stuff like that are tools to that end. We're gonna shoot you something that we know is going to grab your attention. So they're constantly trying to steal control of our own attention, our own mind away from us. And you have to be very deliberate and kind of trying to trying to resist that kind of control by turning off notifications, by doing anything possible to maintain control over your attention yourself. So, I mean, those are a couple of things that I think have been helpful. But I as it's very, very difficult. What we've seen is that the technology has been deeply entwined into all sorts of social processes.
Yeah.
More and more, you can't do anything unless you have the app required to do it. So society as a whole, whether or not we like it or not, society as a whole has become re-engineered to assume that everybody is connected all the time. And so rejecting all of that means isolating yourself from society. And most people are not going to do that.
It's even hard to just do things like banking if you don't have the app, because for two-factor verification they want you to have the app. So even if you said I'm only going to use it on my desktop, well, that's not how they want to do it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, you're constantly, when I still use my desktop. I still think a big desktop computer is the best form of personal computing. But
Yeah.
I'm constantly encouraged. Oh well, use the app, and I'm like, I can't. And so yeah, it's definitely changed.
I mean, I'm certainly not a virtuous user of the internet either, uh, and I find that it's often as coarse for me as sort of rough as saying if I'm going to write or if I'm going to read for a few hours, the phone is just literally in a different room. Because even if it's off and it's near me, I could turn it on, I could see, because there's always this allure. Maybe there's something interesting. I bet if I opened up Twitter, they would show me something to be angry about.
Right.
And so it has to be, I have to put up I guess you could say I'm introducing friction into
Right.
my own use. Yeah.
And there's been some very interesting experiments showing that if you have your phone with you, even if it's turned off, because you know that there's new stuff that's going to be interesting to you on there. If you turn it on, part of your attention, part of your mind is always monitoring the device, even when it's off.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because so as kind of some of the researchers say, either you're using your phone, you're thinking about using your phone, or you're resisting the impulse to use your phone. And
Mhm.
they've also found that physical distance, as you said, is can actually temper that effect. If it's not there in your pocket or on your desk or something, it has less of a pull on your attention than if it's in another room. So those type of things, those type of things actually are helpful.
Yeah.
I think one of the sad things is that as soon as smartphones came along, there was this universal assumption, oh, this is so useful that we need to keep it on our person all the time, all the
Yeah.
time. And if we had at the beginning say, this is very useful for certain things, but it gets in the way of other aspects of my life, we might have said, I don't need to carry this thing with me all the time. I just need it I need to grab it when there are particular things that it's going to be useful for.
Mhm.
But from the start, we all just said, this is going to be on my person all the time.
So I live in Austin, and around here we have a lot. It's the home of Alamo Drafthouse as like a movie theater, and it's sort of famous for its anti-phone policy. And I found, especially maybe post-COVID when it reopened, I think every single time I go, I see someone sneaking their phone out to check it. And this is a movie theater chain that plays like a 2-minute short film explaining to you why it's important to not have your phone on. And you've chosen to go and to this movie theater in particular.
You've chosen to go somewhere because you know you're not going to be able to use your phone, and then you use your phone. So it shows you the pull of the technology.
This has been a great conversation, and I just want to end with a recommendation for our listeners. We're asking people, in an effort to get offline, maybe we're asking guests to recommend a book to our listeners. Maybe it's a book everybody should read, but nobody is. So, do you have anything for them?
Earlier, you had mentioned Neil Postman, who wrote a lot about television. And the one book, if people know him for anything, it's for his famous best-selling book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, about television. But after that, he wrote a shorter book that I think is, and I love Amusing Ourselves to Death, but the shorter book was called Technopoly, which was more, in some ways, looked ahead to computers and kind of things that are online, even though that was very rare at the time. And I think in many ways it was even more prophetic than Amusing Ourselves to Death. So I would recommend finding that book, Technopoly by Neil Postman. It's also a short book, so you don't have to have a huge attention span anymore to read it, but it's just filled with kind of insights that I think have become even more insightful as the technology has progressed.
Well, Nicholas Carr, thank you for joining us here at The Honest Broker.
Thanks. I enjoyed it.